started here. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Sally Baraka. I've been a proud supporter of the Welcoming Center since I first met the organization's founder, Ann O'Callaghan, nearly 18 years ago. It's hard to believe how time flies. I love the people, I love the mission of the Welcoming Center because of the hope and the promise that it stands for. As the daughter of immigrants, I can personally attest to the hard work ethic and big dreams that immigrants to the US all share. And the Welcoming Center is such an important resource to those immigrants looking to manifest the American dream. I can personally recall hearing the story of the man from Egypt, as my father would call his story. And despite the challenges and the difficulties, there was always a bright spot in these stories when he came to meeting the International House and being part of the International House. And I know that this is not the International House and it's a very different organization, but still I want to highlight for everyone the moment of hope that immigrants feel when they come together with other immigrants and persevere in their new home. The Welcoming Center, like most nonprofits, relies heavily on donations of all sizes to continue operating. If you would like to support the Welcoming Center, there are a few ways to do it, and it will be posted in the chat, or you can always donate online at thewelcomingcenter.org. Today, we are delighted to have Bill Stock present 300 years of immigration policy in America, past, present, and future. Bill is both a board member of the Welcoming Center and a founding partner at Klasko Immigration Law Partners. Bill is also a past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He will be joined for a Q&A session by the Welcoming Center's board chair, Anuj Gupta, whose graduate school research paper published 20 years ago highlighted the importance of welcoming immigrants as a crucial growth strategies for cities like Philadelphia. Without further ado, please welcome Bill Stock.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that warm introduction. And also thank you, Anuj, for joining. We'll hear from Anuj at a couple of points during today's presentation about kind of where immigration is, where it came from, and what can we see in the near future as we look forward to the new administration and some of the initiatives that are being proposed here. So let's start with a little bit of history. For perspective, it's useful. This person said that these immigrants are the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. This person was concerned that the children didn't learn English, and that in fact, if these immigrants became elected representatives, that there would need to be an interpreter in the assembly. Who are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about German immigrants. Those are all quotations from a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote in 1753. I use this to really show that the question of how successful America is in immigrating its immigrants is really just part of the foundation story of America. It has always been part of our story. You know, if we look back, each group of newcomers, going back to the 1830s to the 1860s, the Irish Catholics were the big concern. In the 1870s to the 1940s, it was the Chinese, the Japanese, and the West Coast who were the big concern. From the 1900s to the 1940s, it was Southern and Eastern Europeans who were the big concern. You see some of the propaganda that was done against those groups of immigrants, all of whom have become part of American society in the years since then, and no one's really concerned about. But the level of anti-immigrant rhetoric that we hear today against some groups of newer arrivals is exactly the same kind of rhetoric that was employed against even the many of the folks who have the longest ties in the United States of their families. Well, if you go back far enough, someone was concerned about them as a group of immigrants. If we look back at how the United States regulated immigration over the years, from the founding of the United States until really the 1880s, so pretty late in the 19th century after the Civil War, there really weren't any kinds of substantive limits on the amount of immigration to the United States. And that's understandable. It was a very large continent. The United States was growing. There was an enormous opportunity here, both in land and in industrial work as the country industrialized. So it was really only as we got to the 1880s that you begin to see sustained efforts to reduce the flow of immigrants. The first limitations that were put were national origin based. Again, sort of it's a bit of the almost a founding sin of the immigration law, that the first immigration restrictions were called the Chinese Exclusion Acts. They were specifically written in order to prevent Chinese laborers from coming into the United States. They were expanded to prevent Chinese immigrants who had lived here from being able to return to the United States if they visited home. And so that really was kind of at the foundation of US immigration controls, was this very racist idea that somehow Chinese nationals could not become US citizens. At the same time, it's very important to note that in this same era, at the same time that Congress was saying there could be no new immigration from China, the Supreme Court did affirm that the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution meant any person born on United States soil was a citizen of the United States, even if that person was not was not white, was not black, right? If they were Asian, if they were from any country, if you were born in the United States, the Supreme Court said, you are a citizen of the United States. One of the most important legal tools we have for ensuring the integration of immigrants into our society is that their children born here are United States citizens, no questions asked. There are some very fringe legal theories that are maybe getting some more mainstream kind of views right now that try to argue that somehow the 14th Amendment doesn't say what it says. But the Supreme Court way back in the 1880s, in a case called Wong Kim Ark versus United States, said that people born in the United States were United States citizens, full stop. So going forward, we get to the first serious limit on worldwide immigration is the 1924 Quota Act. And in 1924, immigration restrictionists thought there were too many people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so they set quotas on the number of new immigrants per country who could come into the United States. Higher quotas for ethnic groups that were represented in the American population in the 1880 census. So they went back specifically 40 years before the great wave of immigration from Italy, from the Balkans, from Russia. That great wave of immigration had changed the composition of the immigrant flow to the United States. The 1924 Quota Act very consciously went back to the 1880 census, set very low quotas for the countries that were actually sending immigrants to the United States in the 1920s, and set higher quotas on the countries where people were no longer coming to the United States. It's important to note that the Quota Act also had and what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. It prevented immigration from China, from Japan, from India, from anywhere in Asia. And Africa also had no quotas that were set for it. At the same time, Mexico and Latin America had no quotas at all. So there, even in this time of national origin quotas, if you were from Mexico or if you're from Latin America and you were part of these communities that stretch along the US-Mexico border, you basically could come in and choose to live in the United States as an immigrant at any time you wanted without any kind of legal controls. So that's a very different perspective than we have today. At that time, there was no illegal immigration from Mexico because immigrating from Mexico was not controlled, was not illegal in any way. What did immigration look like in Philadelphia over the course of those years? Anuj, you've looked at this. What can you tell us about Philadelphia as a destination for those immigrants from the 1880s onward?
Well, Bill, and thanks again for putting this together, and you've provided a very comprehensive overview of both national immigration policy and what's to come. But Philadelphia is a really interesting story because this is a city that, like every other older post-industrial city in the United States right now, was built entirely by immigrants. And yet, for a variety of reasons, both sort of a collision of narrow-minded local decisions combined with national circumstances, Philadelphia went from being a very heavily populated city by immigrants to a period during the 20th century when we had literally fallen off the map as an immigrant destination point. It is only in recent years, as the city emerged from 55 years of population decline, that we have started to become a magnet for immigrants from around the world once again. And that is what is fueling, we have seen incremental population growth every year in Philadelphia for the last, I believe it's 12 years running now. And by and large, that population growth is fueled by immigration. So we are seeing an infusion of new residents in the city. They are revitalizing commercial corridors that were once forgotten. They are repopulating neighborhoods. They are investing in housing and business startups. And we'll go on the list of what some of the both moral and economic benefits of regaining our status as an immigrant destination point are. But we had really lost our position for a good 50, 60-year period and are only starting to climb out of that now.
Yeah, and you can see that it's in the 1950s, the 1950 bar chart, is the highest population of the city of Philadelphia. And you see the total population begin to fall as the immigrant percent of the population falls. So there were the same number of US citizens living in Philadelphia from 1950 to 1970, but fewer and fewer immigrants were being encouraged to come here. And then, of course, both the native and immigrant population begin to fall until 2000, when we see that reversal starting to happen. And obviously, the Welcoming Center and the work that it's doing, is part of this community-wide realization that attracting immigrants and making Philadelphia an immigrant destination is really good for the city. I say this as an immigrant to the city myself. I grew up in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, out in the Midwest, moved to Philadelphia in 1993, and have really never looked back. It's a wonderful place to live. How do immigrants come legally? That's one of the questions I often get, and it's helpful to have that as a baseline of understanding. So from 1965, sort of at the end of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights era, one of the sort of very foundation-shaking changes was made to the immigration laws. No longer does national origin determine the number of immigrants who can come from a particular country. From 1965 onward, the Immigration and Nationality Act has said that there are 5 main pathways to becoming a legal immigrant in the United States. And it's important to note, you must be a legal immigrant in the United States for at least 5 years for most folks in order to become a US citizen. There's no skipping over the legal immigrant step to become a US citizen, other than by being born here, or in certain circumstances, by being born outside the US to parents who are US citizens. So this legal immigration system, which brings in about 1 million new immigrants per year, is the pathway through which people are allowed to become US citizens. First, they get their green cards, then they move on to citizens. So you see from the pie chart sort of how those percentages break out, but let's go into a little bit more detail. So the first path is the family reunification path. This path allows US citizens to sponsor a spouse or a child, or once they're 21 years old, a parent. That accounts for between 400 and 500,000 new immigrants per year. Most of those are spouses of US citizens. There's no quota or limit on the number of spouses or children who are adopted from overseas, or parents once people are 21 who can be sponsored. I should note that just having a child in the United States doesn't really give you any advantage, doesn't really give you any status. That child has to reach 21 years old. And normally you have to have entered the United States legally if you want that child to sponsor you, unless you've been living back in your home country. So, again, one of the sort of myths that we often hear is, oh, people come in and they have a baby and then suddenly they're able to do everything in the United States. Nope, not true at all. Having a child in the United States is, you have to be very patient if that's your strategy for becoming a legal immigrant, because you're going to have to wait 21 years before that comes to fruition. Now, in addition to the uncapped categories of spouse, children, and parent, there is also the quota limited cap. So the next group are US citizens who have adult sons and daughters, whether they're married or not, and the brothers and sisters of US citizens. So US citizens can sponsor their son or daughter if the son or daughter has turned 21. They can sponsor their brother or their sister, and they can sponsor the family members, the spouse and children of those relatives. Now, the big challenge in the family-based immigration system is that, first off, these are the only family relationships. Cousins, uncles, aunts, all of this none of those people can be sponsored in the immigration system. Also, the number of visas that are available each year is limited, and the number of people who want them is large. So for many of these categories, you will be looking at a 10-year wait before your family member's place in line is reached. You'll file to sponsor them, you'll wait for 10 years, and then they will be able to come to the United States as an immigrant. So again, reunifying with family, a very important principle in immigration law, but it takes some patience, and there are a lot more people who want these visas than there are visas available each year. Also, green card holders can sponsor spouses and children and unmarried sons and daughters. But again, long waits if you're a green card holder and you want to now bring in your spouse. Very often, those green card holders become a US citizen after 5 years and move into the category of sponsoring their family members in that sort of shorter line, sorry. Now, after the family reunification path, the second most common path is skills-based immigration or employment-based immigration. So this system, generally speaking, requires the person to show that they have a job offer and that job offer is in an area where there's some sort of undersupply of US workers. Generally speaking, there are more open positions, for example, in some of the high-skilled fields than there are people who are available to take those positions. So information technology, analytics, STEM fields are one of the areas where employment-based immigration often gets used. But you know what? We do a lot of employment-based immigration for positions that are not in STEM. They might be medical positions, they might be nurses, they might be physical therapists, and they're not just coming to work in places like Philadelphia. They're out in Carbon County and the Appalachian area of Pennsylvania. They are revitalizing communities and providing essential services to those communities and immigrating. So this is a way for areas to recruit people who they need into their communities. This is a way for people who have skills to be sort of matched with opportunities in the US labor force. This employment-based immigration system has not been updated since 1990, so it's now about 30 years out of date. And it is important to note that most people who use the employment-based immigration system come here on some sort of temporary visa, which allows them to work while they're waiting for that green card process to work. How do they come here? Well, a very large number of them come as international students at undergraduate and graduate schools here in the United States. There were over a million international students in the United States in 2018. And those students contribute over $37 billion to the United States economy every single year. So there's some calculations that I've seen that over 500,000 jobs in the United States are directly dependent on the expenditures that international students make in the United States. That's not just the tuition they pay, that's the meals they eat, the places they stay, the Uber rides they take, all of that kind of stuff is a huge contribution to the US economy. It makes higher education one of the largest exports from the United States. And remember, Greater Philadelphia really punches above its weight when it comes to attracting international students. We have wonderful institutions of higher education here, and they attract students from all over the world. Those students can then get employment-based visas and positions in the United States, and we get to take the advantage of the education that they've gotten before they came to the United States and that they've gotten in the United States. Another source is people who are transferred by their employer. So there are several large employers in the Philadelphia region that are multinational companies. They will often transfer people between branches of their company. So you might have somebody who was the marketing manager for France who gets promoted to become the marketing manager for Pennsylvania and will be transferred to the United States. There's also a significant amount of foreign direct investment. So a French company decides that it wants to purchase a US company, or it wants to found a branch in the United States. That's foreign direct investment, we call that. They'll obviously want to send executives, key personnel to the US to be able to help run that company. And that's another source of temporary arrival that then becomes the employment-based green card process. And finally, there's a lot of international scholarship that happens. University faculty who come here who are recruited from abroad, or who bring their research or are collaborating in research with US institutions. That's another big source of people here on temporary employment-related visas. So that was the second path to legal immigration, employment-based migration. The third and fourth paths we'll just mention briefly. There is a law which allows people to invest just under $1 million. The investment has to create at least 10 jobs. And if that is sustained for a period of 2 years, it does allow the person to get a green card on the basis of their investment. This is a fairly small program. It's about 1% of the total immigration per year, but obviously has a significant economic impact. Then there is a lottery. What's called the diversity visa is meant to kind of counteract the fact that we don't have these national origin quotas anymore, and that for many years there were people who came from countries that don't send very many people here. So what this tries to do is it says, if your country or area of the world generally doesn't send very many immigrants to the United States, we're going to give you the chance to come here. You have to show that you have a high school education or that you have job skills. And again, it's limited to about 5% of the total, but it is by lottery. And so people who are motivated to come here do have a path to come here. The countries that get the highest number in that lottery are, ironically enough, Europe, because it doesn't send very many people to the United States anymore. They have a significant number. And then countries in Africa are the other big source of people who win the diversity lottery. Because again, migration from Africa is relatively low when you compare it to some of the other parts of the world. The final part, or the last path, is what you might call humanitarian immigration. In the law, we talk about two different things that are sometimes understood by the public to be the same thing, and that is refugees and asylees. Both of those groups of people are people who have some sort of fear of being persecuted if they return to their home country. That persecution might be because of their race, their nationality, their ethnicity, their tribe, their political opinion, or some other social group that they belong to. If they have a fear of persecution because people like them are persecuted in the country that they come from, there are two ways to come here. We talk about refugee processing when we look at a population of people who are outside the United States, typically who are also outside of the country that they are from. So if you look at the situation, for example, of the Rohingya, who were driven out of Myanmar by the military government there, they're currently sort of stuck in Bangladesh. Bangladesh doesn't have great facilities. Those people could, for example, be granted refugee status because they can't go back to their home country. They can't settle where they are. They can be resettled in the United States. And Philadelphia has always had a very strong tradition of resettling refugees from all over the world. And we have a number of wonderful organizations that do refugee resettlement. For the last 4 years, this refugee program has been almost completely eliminated. We are now seeing it be revitalized under the current administration. Refugees are different from asylum. Asylum refers to the idea that if you are in the United States, if you get to the border, if you come to a port of entry, if you came here on a visa, but that's expired, for whatever reason, if you get here and are afraid to go home, you may ask for asylum. It is a perfectly legal way to come to the United States. And so that's what many people who come to the southern border are hoping to do today. And we hear about these stories, and some people call it a crisis, and some people call it a flood, and people have all kinds of names for this. But what's really going on is there is a legal process where if you come to the United States, if you're afraid to go home, you articulate that fear, and then you get the chance to prove that you meet this standard of a well-founded fear of persecution. And processing those folks is something that has always needed to be done on the southern border, and how much attention anybody pays to it seems to be directly proportionate to the number of reporters who want to talk about it on the news, not actually to the numbers that are involved at any given time. So that's it. Those are the only 5 paths to come here legally: through family, through employment, through the diversity lottery as a refugee, and some very minor programs. So, so really what happens then kind of once they get here? What does the immigrant population of the United States look like right now? So here's some questions I thought it might be helpful to explore. How many immigrants are currently here? What percentage of people? How many have become US citizens? How many lack any kind of legal immigration status? And where in the United States do they live? If you look at this chart, you can see how over the history of the United States, this chart goes all the way back to 1850. And you can see from the 1850s to 1920, immigrants made up about 14% of the United States population. In 1924, as we heard, the Quota Act made a very conscious decision to try and reduce the percentage of Americans who were immigrants. And you can see from the chart that between the 1924 Quota Act, the Great Depression, World War II, all of those things were very successful in reducing the absolute number of immigrants in the United States, and also the percent of immigrants as a share of the population. So it's really only very recently that we've approached that 14% level that was historically the case between the 1850s and 1924, as the immigrant population of the United States has increased. If you look at the sort of roughly 45 million immigrants who live in the United States, actually just under half of them, 20 million, are citizens of the United States. They've lived here for at least 5 years, many of them for quite a bit longer than that. They've gone through the process of choosing to become American citizens and taking the oath of allegiance to the United States. So that's, the biggest number of immigrants in the United States are actually immigrants who have become citizens. The next group that you see there in the lighter brown is lawful permanent residents, green card holders, about 12 million green card holders in the United States. As each new group of green card holders becomes eligible to become US citizens, that population of naturalized citizens continues to grow. And then of course we add roughly 1 million immigrants, legal immigrants to that pool every year. There's about 2 million who are here on temporary visas. We talked about 1 million student visa holders, another million on various kinds of work-related visas for longer periods of time. This doesn't count the number of visitors to the United States, right? So it's also a very important contributor to the US economy. Tourists who come to see the Liberty Bell and the Constitution Center, there are almost 50 million tourist entries to the United States, but of course, most of those people just stay for a few weeks. They aren't counted in those numbers that you see there. And then you have the unauthorized immigrant population, about 10.5 million right now. We'll come back to those folks in just a bit. Why didn't those folks come legally? Well, they didn't fit on one of those 5 paths. So they came here anyway. We'll talk a little bit about how we kind of got there in a minute. If we look at where immigrants live in the United States, this map shows the cities that have very large immigrant populations. In some ways, it's a little bit misleading to just look at this number because the cities account for just over half of the immigrant population in the United States. The rest of the immigrant population in the United States is spread out all over the country. So every single country, every single county in the United States has a significant immigrant population. And you can find immigrants living anywhere, living everywhere in the United States. But let's talk about sort of Philadelphia is, in competition with or looking to attract those legal immigrants. And that's really kind of the effort of the Welcoming Center. If people choose, they've come here as a family-based immigrant or whatever, if they choose to come to Philadelphia, sort of how do we make this attractive? Anuj, why don't we have you talk about that a bit?
Thanks, Phil. So I think there's two buckets in which we need to think about immigrant integration and attraction. One is there is a very basic moral argument in favor of it. If you look at what the history of this nation is, right, which by the way is a series of new people coming in from different regions of the world and trying to close the door behind them so that others don't come in. Nonetheless, unless you are Native American or Native American origin, you either came here voluntarily or involuntarily from somewhere else in the world. This is entirely a nation built by immigrants. And the minute that we cast that aside from a policy perspective, politically, etc., we are losing sight of what the United States has been built on. So that's a very basic moral argument. There is also a very strong economic argument, and I want to paint the picture for that in a moment. But to do that, I want to set a local context and take folks back about 20 years in time. Late 1990s Philadelphia. So we are still in the midst of that 55-year population decline trend. In the 1990s alone, the city of Philadelphia lost over 5% of its net population. At the same time, we had a period in the city's history where folks started to think differently about the city. They started to look at it with a positive framework. Ed Rendell was finishing up his successful time as mayor of Philadelphia. And we entered a new mayor's race in 1999, where we had 6, 7, 8 candidates. It was a wide open field. All of them were talking about strategies to stem and mitigate the impact of population decline. Not a single candidate was talking about how to repopulate the city. And at the same time, if you looked at other large post-industrial cities, New York, Boston, Chicago, Washington, San Francisco, in that same period, all were seeing substantial population growth entirely because of immigration. So we enter the new century a step behind our metro peers. And when we go into the 2000s, we have no civic infrastructure whatsoever at the state or local level to assist with immigrant integration. Now, I'm going to come back to how the Welcoming Center fills that void, but let me move on to the next slide because I want to move to that economic bucket. The economic argument for being a immigrant-friendly city, an immigrant-friendly region, is crystal clear. Right? Just in Philadelphia alone, immigrants are 35% more likely to start a new business than native-born population. The immigrant population that we have seen come here over the last 20 years comes with a higher college attainment rate, and they now comprise a very substantial portion of our local labor pool, 19%. And you can see the bar graph here showing what a substantial proportion of Main Street business owners are immigrant entrepreneurs. Now, the Welcoming Center starts through really a volunteer effort. It was a group of civic advocates, including our founder and original CEO, Ann O'Callaghan, who wanted to assist a group of young immigrants who were facing enforcement action by the then federal agency in the early 2000s. after successfully helping them, they thought maybe we can do something to provide resources to more newcomers in the Philadelphia area. So they started what was called the Pennsylvania Immigrant Resource Center, PIRC, which in a matter of just a few years, because there was such a void, because local government failed to act, and because state government failed to act, there was no other player other than our sister organizations like HIAS, Nationality Services Center, Lutheran Charities, etc., that were assisting with refugee and asylee resettlement. But there was no one focused on economic integration of recent arrivals to the Philadelphia area. And that is the void that the Welcoming Center started to fill, and now has become a national model for doing so around the country. So in essentially a 15, 16-year period since its original inception, the Welcoming Center has taken Philadelphia from being many decades behind where our peer metro regions were to becoming a national model for how we pursue economic integration here locally.
Thanks for that perspective. I think the Welcoming Center, this are some quotes from that 2015 report that the bar graph came from, talking about building from a base of helping immigrants to do things like open businesses, but now also helping other people in the same communities that those immigrants have now revitalized is really an important part of the mission of the Welcoming Center. So there have been some questions about immigrants without status in the United States popping up in the chat, and let's move on to sort of that weighty problem that we have in the United States right now, that 10 million folks who lack legal immigration status. So here's just a couple of charts that look at both the absolute number, that's the chart on your left side there. The population has actually declined from its height of 2005. There were 12.2 million undocumented immigrants in 2005, and that's 2017. We see those numbers dropping to 10.5 million. And part of that story is a significant number of immigrants from Mexico opting to return back home, having worked in the United States. The population who is left is 66% people who have lived in the United States for at least 10 years. So only 20% of the undocumented population has been in the United States for 5 years or less. How did we get to this? Well, let's go back to 1965. Prior to 1965, there's no limits on migration to the United States from Mexico, and to a lesser extent from Central America. It was further away, it was harder to get to the United States, so there was less migration from Central America in the 1960s, but all through the 1800s, the 1920s, the 1950s, in 1945, during the World War II, there's actually a program to encourage Mexican labor to come to the United States and take jobs that are left vacant by the large part of the population that was enlisted into the army. Okay, and so there is a community that is 150 years old of people who have family on both sides of the border, of people who have employment on both sides of the border. There's a lot of circular migration that happens. Young men come, they work in agriculture, they work as cowboys, they work all over the Southwest, and they save up their money and then they go back home. So that kind of circular migration was a very large feature of the labor market in the southwestern United States, and of a kind of an integrated economy of the United States and of Mexico. And in 1965, Congress says, well, we're going to apply the same limits or quotas. You have to have a family relationship, you have to have an employment sponsor, skills, et cetera, to that cross-border migration flow. So the unintended consequence of the 1965 Immigration Act is to create illegal immigration from Mexico for the first time in 300 years. And of course, people now continue to do this. And so in 1986, you wind up with a population of just over 2 million unauthorized immigrants. The policy decision is, well, the magnet that is bringing them to the United States is the ability to work. It was not illegal to work without authorization back in those days. It was not illegal to hire someone who had no authorization back in those days. So in 1986, Congress reaches this grand compromise that says we will grant legal status and amnesty to the 2 or so million people who are here without authorization. They will get on that green card track. They'll eventually be able to become citizens. And in exchange, employers are going to have to check legal immigration status and identity anytime they hire a person. So if you've been hired in a job and you wondered why you had to bring your driver's license and your social security card on the first day of work, well, this is it. This law in 1986 is what created that I-9 process that you have to do anytime you start a new job. Of course, the unintended consequence of that is that you now have a market for false documentation, things that look like the person has legal status. If an 18-year-old can get a false document to get into a bar, it's probably possible for somebody to get a false document that looks like they're able to work in the United States. And so that market kind of really takes off after 1986. Then in 1990, Congress reforms the legal immigration system, but really focuses the attention on the high-skilled end of the legal immigration system. They don't focus nearly as much on the continuing needs of US agriculture, US construction industries, US food processing industries. A lot of these places where you think of, hey, there's a lot of undocumented immigrants who are working in this industry, well, that's because there are not the same legal routes for having people come in who want to do those jobs when there are not US workers available for it. Congress kind of waffles back and forth. In 1994, they passed one law which tries to encourage those undocumented immigrants to use the legal immigration system to get sponsored by an employer if it is shown. Well, in 1996, Congress turns around and passes what's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Control Act, which is passed to block unauthorized immigrants from being able to use the legal immigration system. In the meanwhile, in the background, in 1994, NAFTA goes into effect in Mexico. And the unintended consequence of that is that the Mexican agricultural economy is completely devastated. And all of a sudden, you have a huge number of Mexican migrants coming north to work in what is a booming 1990s American economy in the construction fields, in food processing, in all these places. So NAFTA, sort of creates this, again, unintended consequence of increasing the supply of people who are potentially interested in coming to the United States for work. Well, Congress sometimes helps and sometimes tries to restrict immigration. You see in 1996 and 7, there was these laws that help some Central Americans and Haitians to legalize their status. These are individuals who had come and applied for asylum. And basically, there was a sense that if you came to the United States from a left-wing country like Nicaragua, that you would get asylum if you said that you were afraid of your government. But if you came to the United States from Haiti, or if you came to the United States from El Salvador, where it was a right-wing government or a government that was allied with the United States, and you said you were afraid of your government, that you didn't get asylum. And that was a little too political. And so with this large backlog of 300,000 Central Americans and Haitians who were in the United States, Congress said, you know what, we're just going to even this out. We're going to give all those people status. They've been here for a long time. At the same time, 1993 is when the Border Patrol starts something they call Operation Hold the Line. So for the first time, they start really putting a physical police presence at the border. And up until 1993, it was very typical for people to be able to just walk across the border anywhere in the city of El Paso, anywhere in the city of Tijuana. You would just be able to walk in and blend right into the population. Again, 150 years of circular migration. Well, the Border Patrol starts building fences in these high volume areas where it's easy to cross. This begins to push illegal migration out of the cities and into much more rural areas, into some very harsh desert territory, for example, and makes the crossing much more perilous. That has two unintended consequences. The first unintended consequence is it makes the drug cartels in Mexico have a very profitable sideline, which is smuggling people to the United States, because now people can't just walk across the border in Tijuana into San Diego. The second thing it does is people, once they have crossed the border, become very reluctant to go back home. Having crossed the border and come here to work, they then bring family members to join them because they're no longer going back to Mexico. They're no longer going back to Central America, to their home countries. And you get another sort of wave of follow-on immigration as the other parent, the child, come to the United States. So the harder we make the border, the bigger the incentive for people to stay once they've actually gotten here. From 2000 on, we begin to see this trend where the Mexican population has a smaller percentage of the population entering the working years. They have enormous improvements that the Mexican government made in education, in the availability of healthcare, et cetera. This has really changed the number of young Mexican workers looking to come to the United States. And in fact, the undocumented population of Mexicans in the United States has fallen consistently for about the last 10 years. Central Americans, however, because of the problems, the weather, the bad government, the crime in those cities have increased as a percentage of people showing up and looking to enter the United States. But if you want to know the largest number of new undocumented immigrants, they are people who get a legal visa of some kind. Maybe they come as a tourist, for example, and they overstay that visa. That's actually now the largest number of people who are undocumented in the United States. There have been a whole bunch of efforts, 2001, 2007, 2013. Congress looks to come up with some compromise, right? Some in Congress say we want to and only do enforcement. If we just enforce things enough, these 10 million people will go home, even though 4 million of them have US citizen children. Others say, no, we have to give them a path to legal status. They really can't come to a compromise between these two extremes, and so those efforts fail. So the last 4 years, we've seen an administration which really doubled down on this idea that not only was illegal immigration bad, but immigration was bad for the United States. So we see these border enforcement measures, increasing detention, separating families, building a wall, refusing to allow people to come into the United States to assert their lawful claim for asylum. We see interior enforcement measures, cooperating with police, arresting any person who they encounter who is not documented and processing them for removal. Even legal immigration being restricted through what they called their Buy American, Hire American initiative, putting pressure on companies not to sponsor immigrants even if they couldn't find the skills that they need, barring travel. If you remember, almost the week after the inauguration, President Trump signed the travel ban against almost all Muslim countries in the United States. That was later reduced to simply 7 countries, but it still affects about 60,000 people. And of course, sort of unnoticed in the pandemic has been using the pandemic as an excuse to bar travel, to bar legal immigration in ways that were would never be acceptable in normal times. These have all were all put in place as part of a very conscious effort by the prior administration to restrict not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration too. And now our Biden administration has taken a whole new tone. They've rescinded most of these travel bans. They've tried to say very emphatically, America is still a nation of immigrants. We do still welcome people to come to the United States. They've announced a goal of resettling more refugees from abroad back to the sort of levels that were normal for the last 20, 30 years. Trying to better manage the southern border, to actually look back to the sending countries to say, what can we do to improve conditions in these Central American countries such that people are better able to live their life there, don't feel the need that they have to come to the United States because they're afraid of living at home. They've set priorities for removal. If you commit a criminal act, if you're recently crossing the border, if you're commit certain crimes, these are what are going to be the priorities that the law enforcement officers should be following, not just rounding up any person who they can find who happens to be undocumented. They're preserving this program called DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. For people who were brought to the United States by their parents as young children, may have lived their entire life in the United States, this DACA program provides a temporary reprieve from deportation. It gives them the right to work in the United States, to get a social security number, to contribute better to the US economy. This administration is preserving that and looking for opportunities to expand it. They're also pushing immigration reform bills. Things, again, taking up this mantle that fell in 2007 and 2013, saying, no, we aren't going to deport our way out of 10 million people in the United States, almost all of whom have some U.S. family member, many of whom have U.S. children, many of whom were, have lived in the United States for more than 10 years. They're pushing bills that will give those groups of people a path to legal status. It's interesting to note that there are states which are challenging the Biden administration's ability to do these things. So just as you saw the travel ban being challenged by the state of Hawaii, just as you saw the DACA rescission being challenged by the state of California and by many other states, you're seeing exactly the opposite dynamic play around now, that states like Texas and Arizona are challenging the ability of this administration to make changes to the system without Congress passing a law. So I think we're going to see a lot more court fights, continuing court fights over this immigration policy while we're doing it. Anuj, I don't know what you see in terms of kind of paths forward, at this moment.
So thanks, Bill. Just a few comments I would add. One, the sad truth is that a policy area that was previously largely bipartisan and immune from the increasing politicization of almost any issue you can imagine has now become subject to those divides. And the president has set forth a very ambitious and comprehensive immigration overhaul, one that is long overdue, and it will get its fair hearing and a vote in the House of Representatives. What happens in the Senate, particularly given the political divide there, is difficult to say, and there's not a great chance of success. Republicans have already said that they are lining up against it. However, there are two things that I think this administration has already made progress on and will continue to do so over the next 3.5 years. One is executive action. You've outlined some of the steps that the president has already taken, and do not underestimate the impact of that. Just last week, some of my colleagues and I welcomed a woman and her 4 children who had been living in sanctuary for the last 4 years in a Germantown church. They could not leave the premises of that church for 4 years because of executive policy. Now, with a new administration, they have taken a completely different approach. They have narrowed the enforcement priorities, and she and her 4 children are now free to pursue their job opportunities, their schooling, and their livelihood without fear of deportation. So executive action can make a big difference in the day-to-day lives of newcomers to the Philadelphia area and all across the country. But number 2 is simply tone. Okay, the constant rhetoric and the insulting remarks that have come from the very top of this nation for the last 4 years have at least stopped for the moment. And that goes back to a recognition of the moral argument for being a immigrant welcoming city, region, and nation. Right now, we have an administration that gets it, and I think that will go a long way towards repairing not only international dialogue, international relations, but how people view the United States from abroad. And so we'll see. You can't move the legislation forward unless you put it in play. And President Biden did that on day 1. And that was, it's a bold and courageous plan. But even if he cannot succeed on the bold reform that we need, we're still going to see some measurable impact.
Thanks, Anuj. I would agree that one of the most important features of the current administration, or one of the most important things, was that change of tone. I work in the legal immigration system, and it has been remarkable to me that, for every, I've worked for 30 years. I've worked for under, in this field, I've worked under Republican administrations, I've worked under Democratic administrations. The reality is a lot of the plumbing, the infrastructure of that legal immigration system is set in the statute. It's run by agencies that, we saw for years, basically, they tilt a little bit back and forth, but at the end of the day, they're really bound by the law as it's written. For the last 4 years, we really saw agencies who were given a charge to find every way that they could to limit the amount of immigration that they were authorizing to the bare minimum that they just had to do under the statute. Just going back to the rule of law, which is that Congress has said the following kinds of people qualify, go ahead and give them their visas, is an enormous improvement over what we've seen for the leadership for the last few years. And look, I would not mind a return to a Republican administration which acknowledged, as George W. Bush did, that immigrants are a very important part of the United States. He pushed an immigration reform bill. So I think all of us have to be open to collaborating with everyone from wherever they may be who's interested in kind of putting a fix to this system, finally putting a solution for the significant population of folks who've been here for a long time, who have a lot of ties here, and who likely aren't going anywhere. Let's face it. Okay.
And so, Bill, if I could add one more comment, just back to that, the import of tone, and bringing it back to the role that the Welcoming Center has played here in Philadelphia. In that early part of the 2000s, when there was still no investment in certainly government infrastructure in welcoming immigrants here to the Philadelphia region, the Welcoming Center starts and forms and grows to play that role, and starts changing the dialogue and the tone. And I fundamentally believe that the Welcoming Center played an essential role in convincing future mayors, first Michael Nutter and ultimately Jim Kenney, to then open an Office of Immigrant Affairs in City Hall, to start doing naturalization ceremonies in City Hall, to issue executive orders around language access and access to city services, irrespective of status. And so I don't want to downplay the import of simply changing the dialogue. We've seen it here locally, and I want to draw, or I just want to make that connection back to the original request that was made at the beginning of your seminar, which is, if you believe that work can continue to transform our city and region and improve the lives of everyone, not just immigrants and the newest Philadelphians, then support the Welcoming Center. This work cannot be done without ongoing support from individuals. If it's $10, $20, whatever you can give, it will make an impact in changing people's lives here.
Absolutely. One of the questions I often get is, where do I go for reliable information about immigration? Things that aren't overblown, things that try to provide a fact-based analysis. I've gone to a few different places. If you want to hear more about the Welcoming Center, or if you want to donate, it's please, the URL you see there, welcomingcenter.org. I'm also a board member of what's called the American Immigration Council, or a 501c3 that looks to promote justice, promote education about the benefits of immigration to America. And you can find out more about their programs. There are an enormous number of policy papers, many of which are written as sort of a one-page guide to family-based immigration, to employment-based immigration. If you have further questions or are interested in a sort of a deeper dive on some of these things, please go to the AmericanImmigrationCouncil.org. If you're more interested in sort of scholarly takes on it, some really deep dives into immigration history, policy, numbers, you name it, I'd refer you to the next three, the Migration Policy Institute Cato has a very helpful immigration page of immigration resources. And the Pew Research Center does an enormous amount of really, really high quality research on immigration, immigrant attitudes, et cetera. And of course, if you're interested in the employment-based immigration system, I'd refer you to our firm's website, where we have just a really large breadth of material for employers, for immigrants who are interested in accessing the employment-based immigration system. These slides are going to be available to all participants, so do feel free to download them, and we would be more than happy to have you access those kinds of information. So with that, Anuj, do you want to walk us through the questions?
Sure. So let me, there are quite a few questions that have come in. And let me just sort of work from the most recent. So what organizations are working with the community to pass immigration reform? There are certainly a number of national organizations that have already signed on to the Citizenship Act and are calling for its passage. Bill, are you sort of following the advocacy around this bill?
Sure. If you want something that's national, you could look at forward.org. That's fwd.org. That is looking to combine all the stakeholders who are really interested in immigration reform, give them a place to connect. Here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Immigration PICC, I think it is, .org is the coalition of different groups who are united around immigration policy making and influencing immigration policy. So you can also reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to connect people with things where you might have an impact in a way that's most meaningful to you.
Great. Another question from Carmen: what is the best bill in Congress that we need to support? HR 6, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. I would say, I mean, that's sort of the Super Bowl of immigration reform, and that is the most comprehensive package. There are several one-off bills on various reform issues that have already been introduced. There was one that the House passed last week on providing a path to citizenship for the Dreamers. But if HR 6 was to move forward, that will incorporate and address a lot of what some of these one-off bills would otherwise address.
Yeah, and I could rattle off a number of fixes, a number of bills. I think, though, people have to understand that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. HR 6 would certainly address almost all of the problems and would be a very significant relief for the 10 million folks who we were talking about. It would make all kinds of other helpful changes, but I think we also have to be willing to say, if we can get 15 Republicans to sign off on a dream reform bill, and that's not, it's not unhistorical. There have been more than 15 signatures for that in the past. We ought to pass that. Let's fix that part of the problem. And if there's other pieces of the problem, we ought to fix those. So I hesitate to restrict ourselves to just the best bill. The bill that passes, to me, is the best bill.
Yeah, and I would just stress, look, immigration is not just a blue congressional district issue anymore. It's not just in urban areas. There are very vast rural segments of this country that are seeing and have been seeing heavy immigration influxes for some time. And while we may think of those regions as politically red, the members of Congress and senators that represent those areas have a vested interest in representing those folks as well. And so I would encourage friends, family, business colleagues, and organizations that are in those areas to contact their representatives and contact their senators and demand immigration reform.
Yeah, and look, whether it's businesses, whether it's community organizations, whether it's religious organizations, right? So believe it or not, there's an organization called the Evangelical Immigration Table. If you belong to, if that's the faith tradition that you're most comfortable with, there's an evangelical immigration reform group, the Evangelical Immigration Table, you can get involved in. So this is not restricted to any place, profession, you name it. Everyone is coming to the table to help support immigration reform, for sure.
So Phil, this, oh, go ahead.
Please, no.
The next question is from Rong Sorn. Rong is a good friend of mine and a great friend to the immigrant community here in Philadelphia. She's asking if you can talk a little bit more about the 1996 immigration laws.
I could talk a lot about the 1996 law, and probably, people's eyes would begin to glaze over about 30 seconds in. But no, that was I mentioned on the slide, we called it AILA for the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It was really a preview in the law of a lot of the policy and attitude that we saw carried out in the Trump administration. And what it did was increased the use of detention. It mandated detention of enormous sort of categories of people. You could be arrested for bouncing a check. And if your state makes that a crime that you could possibly get 1 year in prison, you'll have to be detained by the immigration authorities while your criminal case is going on. Really, AILA was then supercharged after 9/11 by the interoperation of databases. So civil law enforcement, non-immigration law enforcement would have to interact with federal databases, and the Immigration Service would have much more information about who was getting arrested for what. And in fact, many jurisdictions, Philadelphia included, have kind of said, that's not our job. Like, we don't do immigration enforcement. We got enough to do with, crime and gun control and what's going on in our city. Like, you feds can do your immigration stuff. We're not going to play a part in that. And so that's really been a tension that, kind of reached one high mark in 1996 with that law that said, hey, the way to do immigration enforcement is just to be as strict as possible. No mercy on anybody. If you screw up at all, we're going to deport you. And that's, it's not due process. It doesn't take individual situations into account. It results in a lot of detention, which is very expensive. And so, fixing some of those 1996 things, I think, is another important step that we should be considering.
Thanks, Bill. We have another question from Max. And he's asking if you can talk a little bit more about labor market protections and sort of how they have changed over the course of time as they relate to immigrants.
Yeah, the first immigration quotas were framed as labor market protections. We said, we'll just keep out all the Chinese workers because they're building the railroads, and we're tired of competing with Chinese workers. We don't do that anymore, fortunately, right? We don't just say that some ethnic group is an unfair labor market competition. Instead, what we have is, for some of the temporary visas, right? Seasonal work visas, for example, and for most green cards that you're going to get through employment, the employer is going to have to document to the Department of Labor that there are no qualified U.S. workers available and interested in the position. So that might be because it's a highly technical position, or it has a great specialty, or the employer is trying to bring a new technology into the United States that's only available abroad. But it might also just be because in our little town, we have a really difficult time attracting a doctor, or a physical therapist, or an engineer, or a French baker, right? So that labor market test is actually the employer going and documenting the efforts it's taken to recruit Americans, and that they've been unsuccessful. And that is part of the green card process.
Great, thank you. We just got another question. Is it realistic to go back to the circular migration between Mexico and the United States, which seemed to be working before 1965?
I think yes. In fact, if you go to the Cato website, you'll find a number of papers which look at recent history. As the southern border has been increasingly reinforced, and as the cartels have been able to charge higher and higher amounts for illegally crossing the border, more and more employers have become interested in using what are called the H-2A and H-2B visa programs. These are the temporary, seasonal, agricultural, and non-agricultural work visas. Very often, early in my career, I would have an employer ask me, how do I sponsor temporary workers for, whatever kind of business I'm running? It's a seasonal business. I only need workers. I'm having trouble. The American college kids want to do internships. They don't want to cut grass anymore. Whatever it is, their problem was being presented to me. And I would say, well, here's this H-2B program, and here's how you do it, and here's all the steps you do. And they would say, that's crazy. And they would hire people who didn't have paperwork. Well, the hardening of the southern border has made that paperwork necessary. More employers are willing to sponsor folks to come in legally because it's so hard for people to come in illegally. And there's not this supply of people who've just been able to walk across the border. So I think, yes, that having people come for seasonal work, having them do remittances to their country, to support their family back there, to bring their earnings back to their country, that helps development in that country. They bring skills and connections back to their country. And I think it is that we should encourage both things. We should encourage migration for those people who want to relocate to the United States, but also the opportunity to fill places in the US labor market as our workforce gets older, as we have more people retiring. 10,000 people retired today. 10,000 people are going to retire tomorrow. And that's going to continue for the next 10 years, every single day. That's a huge part, that's a huge shrinkage of our labor force that these kinds of migration programs, of various kinds for various purposes, would be useful to help.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Bill. If you look at any sort of recent economic study of the relationship of GDP and growth to immigration trends, all indicators suggest that when you close your door, you foreclose on future GDP growth. And there is a direct correlation between the two. So again, if you don't subscribe to the moral argument, you should at least recognize the economic argument. Another question from Carmen, is the 287G program still in effect?
So 287G, for folks who don't know, is a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which allows the immigration enforcement agencies to enter into agreements with local law enforcement. That authority still exists. That is unusual authority because it allows the local authority to directly enforce immigration law. As a general matter, it's not always easy to tell whether somebody has lawful status or not. So therefore, there's training that has to happen, oversight that has to happen. Those 287G agreements are mostly being terminated by the current administration because of operational concerns. But there are still a few out there, and the 287G authority does still exist.
Another question, and let me just put folks on notice. We do have about 10 more minutes for questions. So if you do have any, please post them in the chat, and Bill or myself will handle them. So Bill, the next question is an interesting one from Miss Myers. She's a high school teacher, and she works with all immigrant or ESL students. And she's looking to find out if there's any good resources for high schoolers, presumably around immigration policy.
I'd make two recommendations. The first recommendation would be to go to that American Immigration Council website. There is a page for educators there, and there are curricula that are targeted for 5th and 6th graders, for high schoolers, for every age group. They have some suggested readings in those curriculums and some suggested discussion topics and other kinds of exercises. For high school audience, and really for anyone else on the call who's interested in kind of the history of immigration policy, I highly recommend a recent book called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. That is by, her last name is Wang. I apologize, I'm blanking on her first name. She writes for the New York Times, very readable, very accessible, the story of how the 1965 Immigration Act came to be. And of course, the first chapter talks all about how the 1965 Act was necessary and all that came before it. And then, you know, at the end, it does go through a lot of the consequences of that 1965 Act. So it's very accessible. It's certainly appropriate for a high school audience, and recommended for anybody who's interested in immigration policy. I've recently finished it myself. Very good book.
And Bill, just one idea I would add to that, going back to my high school days, is a movie that we watched called El Norte, which really highlights the incredible journey and ordeal that folks will take to cross the border. And they're doing it in pursuit of opportunity. So while we certainly need immigration reform and giving undocumented folks a path towards citizenship, we should also be asking ourselves, why on earth would we close the door on people who have worked so hard and walked so far simply in pursuit of more opportunity? It's an older movie, but I still remember it vividly, and it made a big impression on me at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. Put in a plug for another movie, La Misma Luna, which is, I believe the English title is Under the Same Moon. It's a similar story. And a wonderful book from several years ago called Enrique's Journey by Sonia Nazario, who wrote for the LA Times for another years. Again, hugely impactful on my thinking about the benefits of community development in Central America, the attraction of circular migration that we were talking about. You know, the problem at our southern border is not going to get fixed at our southern border. It's going to get fixed in the countries where these folks come from.
Bill, another question from Brittany. How can employers encourage immigration while also documenting immigration status?
Well, I think, you know, it's important to follow the law, which is that you cannot assume illegal or legal immigration status just because of someone's race or ethnicity or accent. You follow the documentation guidelines, the documentation that people are required to present, that they're allowed to present. And you know, employers can be active in a lot of the employer alliances, the Chamber of Commerce, Forward.us, right? These are organizations of employers who are talking about how do we promote immigration as part of the solution for the workforce of tomorrow, right? It comes along with education. It comes along with building up our U.S. workforce, but also, you know, bringing in folks as well.
Great, thanks, Bill. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think if we can move into closing thoughts from you.
Sure. I first off want to thank everybody for your time and attention. Immigration is it's always been a part of the United States. It's always been controversial in the United States. And people who believe in immigration as part of America, as part of our American story, from my grandparents to folks on the call who may be recently arrived themselves, we all need to stick up for that immigration, for the idea of America as a nation of immigrants, to hold up those ideals. That is really what will allow us to continue to move forward, will help us to stop a lot of the injustices that happen within this system. And so we thank you for any support you can give, for any way that you would like to become more deeply involved. Thank you for that, and we encourage you to do that further.
And I just want to thank Bill on behalf of the board, Peter, and all of the staff for putting the time and effort in to bring this amazing presentation together. Thank you for really outlining it so comprehensively.
Thanks, Anuj. It was a real pleasure. It's always fun to get to speak about kind of what you do for your life. So I thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, thank you. Thanks for tuning in. Again, please consider supporting the Welcoming Center with whatever you can. Every dollar matters, and be safe.